So thank you for coming to this evening's event, Public Fantasy. Judith Berry, one of our senior fellows here at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. We at MIT and locals welcome you, Judith. Thank you for coming. Judith has been an outstanding feminist, voyeur, media productionist, sounding board, evangelical media artist and participant, writer, bookmaker, traveler, and architect. I can't say enough good things about the input that Judith has given me personally over my own artistic career. Born in Columbus, Ohio, she's been everywhere. In fact, I usually see Judith in far-flung cities, not where she lives. Echo in the Shadow of the City, Vampira is an exhibition piece that I saw many years ago, and I'm always reminded of even in my current production. It's also true that many of the things Judith has said over the years appears in the writings of others later, and I'm surprised. But somehow, we all remember Judith when she first said, when she talked about the interactivity as a primal ingredient of art production and spatial construction and identity. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Judith. Thank you for coming.
Hi, well, I want to thank Julia for that great introduction, and also thank CAVS, Larissa, and Meg for having me here as a senior fellow. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I can't turn off the lights? Oh, not yet, just a second. You'll have plenty of chance to sit in the dark. What I'm going to do tonight is to just give you an overview of my work. As an artist, as Julia mentioned, I've been working for a really long time, and I have a lot of different projects. So what I decided to do for tonight is excerpt from a number of types of works rather than giving you much of an overview about any kind of work. And I think for those of you who are students in the audience, it's always really good to know what people's day jobs are and have been, how they've developed through different moments in their career, because I think that's the kind of thing that often you want to take away from one of these sorts of talks. So I will be mentioning those things when I'm talking. I began as an architect, and now you can turn off the lights. I began as an architect, and lucky for me, but probably not so lucky if you're pursuing an architecture career. When I was first out of architecture school, I got a job at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, and almost immediately was laid off. And that propelled me back into school, and I'm talking about 1977 or so. And I went back to school at the San Francisco Art Institute and also began taking classes in University of California at Berkeley in the rhetoric department, which just happened to be the place where all of postmodernity and postmodern thinking was funneling through the United States, through people like Jean-Franz Lyotard, through Raymond Boulour, through Christian Metz, through Derrida, Foucault, et cetera, et cetera. And it was completely an accident and completely by chance that I happened to be there at that time. But being there at that time in San Francisco really framed my thinking and the kind of work that I was doing. And one of the first kinds of work that I started doing was performance art, because when I was going to art school, this is 1977, everybody in art school was a performance artist. And Joan was one of the most famous performance artists of all, and one of the few women who were actually working in performance art. And I remember seeing your performance at 80 Langton Street, I think in 1976. I don't know if you remember that, but I remember, because it was a very compelling moment. So I became interested in performance art, and I also saw performance and the performative as a way of presenting certain kinds of ideas. And at this particular time in performance art, it was transitioning out of performance using the body or about the body so particularly into other forms of media, because we're at the end of the 1970s when questions around video and how video is being used in the art world first come into play. And so what you're looking at here is my actual very first performance, and it was done at 80 Langton Street in 1978, I believe. And what I did, trying to make use of my architecture, because I've never wanted to give anything up or let anything go, is I built out this room at 80 Langton Street in such a way that it housed a 2,000 pound trough of sand that went horizontally across the room. And the screens that you see are projecting stories culled from women's lives. It was a time when questions about identity and the performative in terms of identity, for those of you familiar with Judith Butler, it's the notion that we all perform our identities differently and construct them differently every day. So on these 3 screens, I had all of these different stories of women's lives. And then in front of that, I was performing using a piece of wire mesh, and I was turning that wire mesh into different sculptures, almost like sculptural gesture drawings, using them, 1-minute setups with a pose, another 1-minute setup with a pose, et cetera, for about 20 minutes. Until at one point, after about 10 minutes, this is backwards, but I hung up the screen and made a hammock out of it, and then at a certain point in the performance, I pulled the screen thread that held the sand in place, and all the sand dumped down on me. And that's kind of midway through the performance. And that's the end. And then in true performance fashion, because also these things, they're events and they were one night only. And so about the last thing you wanted to do, this took 2 weeks to build, about the last thing you want to do is clean it up. So I left it up for a week or so until the next performance artist came in and transformed the space. And so this became known as a performance installation. And I think you did that with your work too, then too. But the whole idea of performance installation, which the art world seems to think just happened a year ago, has been around for a very long time. At any rate, this performance led to several other performances where I also was exploring questions of media. And I'm not going to go into them in very great detail, but I did one that took place over 2 weeks at the San Francisco Art Institute in a show called Motion, the Women's Performance Collective. And it basically dealt with soap opera themes, in particular the pleasure associated with performing as an evil character. And in this particular case, it was sort of scenes from a relationship. And I would change the order of 8 scenes over the course of this 2-week period. So it was very, soap opera derived. And these are just some shots of it. And the audience for this was located in the center, and the performance took place all around them. And I used a lot of slides and video and stuff like that. This is another shot from it where people are sleeping, but they're sleeping against the wall. Ultimately, this became a video. And similarly, in another space, La Mamelle, I did another performance called Cup Couch, which explored the relationship between metaphor and metonymy, which are 2 tropes of rhetoric. Again, I was trying to apply what I was learning in graduate school to questions around the performative. And again, the audience was situated in the center of the room, and the media took place all around. And I'm also just mentioning this just to remind people that media and art have been around for a very long time. At any rate, what happened to me in terms of performance was that it was pretty clear to me by the end of the 1980s that I wasn't going to be able to be a performance artist because it was kind of over in the sense of getting people to fund things or even having people invite me to do things. I kind of had missed that particular moment in the art world. And the art world, I think, is and Julia and Joan and Joe and other people may disagree with me, but I think the art world is very periodized by what it will support and what it won't support. So as a young artist and, trying to get out of school, I immediately switched into making videotapes. And while I was making that switch and also trying to come to terms with my interest in film theory, what became known as academic feminism, and also questions about architecture that were still circulating in my thinking, I started to make videotapes. But meanwhile, I also had to have a job. one of those horrible things. And so my job, after I got laid off, was to design party spaces for big corporations. And what you're looking at is San Francisco in the 1980s, excuse me, and it's an old hangar or kind of warehouse space that Coca-Cola took over, and that went from this space to this space. And little did I know, as an extremely young person, that it would be the biggest budget I ever had, because you think, oh, this will just continue forever. And of course it didn't. But this space was built to become a party space for a 2-hour party that Coca-Cola was having for its bottlers in San Francisco. And for those of you who are architecture trained, if you decoded this, you would see that I was very, very influenced by the work of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. In particular, they were my very big heroes in architecture school, and I was particularly affected by learning from Las Vegas, because I decided that how I would manage this space, which was basically a corridor with food, was I would make this series of kind of Disney-esque eating huts, and you would be able to eat your way through the ethnic history of San Francisco. And so this is pretty much all that Coca-Cola agreed to. However, because I was in school and because I was extremely naive, and perhaps it was a good thing, I was also trying to have an effect on the corporate world. And so I kept proposing, well, why don't we do something that's more historically accurate about what happened when Coca-Cola gained hegemony worldwide? And so these are some drawings I made about when Coca-Cola came to Japan, and the Coca-Cola dispenser replaces the refrigerator. I mean, they were meant to be also humorous. I thought I could use irony and humor in the corporate world more successfully than I was able to do. This is China, where the changing room has a Coca-Cola dispenser next to it. And this is the only one that they did do, which unfortunately I don't have any shots of. But the one thing that they did go for was a hut basically made out of recycled Coca-Cola cans that would allow us also to dump garbage, because at a party with 4,000 people in 2 hours and they're only allowed to drink Coke, there's no place for garbage, and nobody wanted to have garbage cans around and that kind of thing. And so we made a moat and made the hut out of recycled Coca-Cola cans, and we featured avocado and sprouts and all of this stuff. We're in 1980 now. We featured all of this, and that was kind of new to the people who were attending the party because they were mostly from the Midwest. So this project I published quite a bit, because also in architecture, as those of you in architecture know, in architecture we have a long tradition of publishing, and that's also often been negatively viewed as paper architecture. However, in the art world, young artists tend not to publish nearly as much. And for me, this project was quite useful because I published it so much that finally curators saw it, and that did lead to further projects. I'm going to show you 2 more architecture projects, and I should also mention that for me, when I was in architecture school, I was thinking about how or what is architecture, and I think that question is still very much both needs to be asked in architecture and very much is asked in most architecture programs, and I know it's asked here at MIT. And what I decided architecture was for me was actually the representation in built space of our social relations. And you can see in that formulation some of the traces of my history or my interests at the time, which were Marxism, questions about feminism, questions about social relations, questions about how people use space, and also how all of these codes or these different forms of conceiving space actually impact the built world. And I've pretty much, even today, still refer to that trope when I'm thinking about architecture vis-a-vis space. At any rate, in 1980, after the Coca-Cola piece, Lynn Hirschman, who's a very well-known artist from San Francisco, had a museum that she called the Floating Museum, and it was an alternative space, essentially, with no permanent space. And she asked me to do a project at a shopping mall that was going out of business in Silicon Valley. And this shopping mall didn't have a Neiman Marcus, it had a Penny's. And the owner of the shopping mall thought, if we only could bring high art here, maybe the rich people would shop here. It was, as you can imagine, a pretty silly idea. But nonetheless, for me, it was a great launching pad to do a project. And again, I referred a lot to the work of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. In the parking lot, I proposed that we make an alternative kind of museum out of the shopping mall. And I called it Display Museum of Signs. And in the windows, I wanted to have a kind of changing panorama of what this museum would be. And it was kind of up to the shopkeepers to make those decisions. I was also basing this very much on notions about the memory theater, which I was very interested in at the time and continue to be interested in, which is a way of reading images and inputting architecture into your mind in order to remember things, as well as a way of encoding information. And so I use this concept of the memory theater in conceiving of this museum. And if you wanted to read about that, Frances Yates is still the best person, and her book is called The Art of Memory. Anyway, at the center of this shopping mall, I located the map. And this is, very typical of a California shopping mall. And this was a map that would describe how the museum worked and functioned, what you could do in this museum. And again, this was totally meant as an imaginary construct. And additionally, I was playing with all kinds of things that had to do with questions about Marxism and psychoanalysis, such as trying to get the shop owners to collaborate on the construction of their displays instead of competing, setting up things within the shop so that you would actually have strange notions about what you desired and what you didn't desire and why. And so it was kind of like a treasure hunt. And in the center is kind of where I located the main part of this. You can also see that this was a very expensive project because it would have cost them a lot of money to actually go to all the trouble of designing and building all these things. And then the final thing I wanted to do with the project was to make a labeling center, so you could, the entire, or at least one store would be under deconstruction a la Derrida. And so, this is, in many ways a graduate project, but still it was very important to me, and it fueled a lot of different research projects. And of course, like all of these sorts of projects, it was not done. Surprise. But what I decided to do, remember, I'm the person who doesn't like to lose anything, was I decided to write an article about it, which I called Casual Imagination. And I also made a videotape because I had spent so much time in the shopping mall making friends with all these people and doing all these studies that I decided, well, how could I make use of this contact and how can I make something out of this? So I made a single channel video called Casual Shopper, which you can go ahead and put that in. Well, actually, let me just set it up first because I'm going to try not to talk over my work, which is something new for me. But what the video was about was it took off from a very important article that was written by Laura Mulvey in 1975. It was called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. And in that article, she's writing as a feminist and also as a film theoretician. She's asking the question, how come in mainstream film, when the woman comes on the screen, the action stops? There's a kiss, an interlude, or something, but virtually nothing happens. Then the kiss is over and the narrative resumes and something happens, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, what would happen if I made a film where when the woman came on the screen, something happened, and when the man came on, he disappeared? And so that's really the kind of logic that underscores this film. And I decided to make it about shopping because shopping is such an interesting trope of 20th century culture, and it has such a long history. If you think about Walter Benjamin and the flaneur, I thought about this female character as a kind of flaneuse. So you can start it. And this is about a 7-minute clip from this film. Oh, okay. Is it playing? Okay, good. Because if it's playing, then we probably missed the clip. For the film, we need to turn the light off. Can we do that? That light, because it'll really make it an already very old VHS look even worse. And it has sound, yeah. You can turn it up.
I'm just looking at those.
Oh.
Just looking.
I should also say that it's not this yellow. We didn't have a chance to do a tech rehearsal, so it's usually more color balanced. One of the things you'll notice is that she kind of becomes a sort of, in becoming a female flaneuse, she kind of becomes a sort of stalker because she follows him or tries to find him in an imaginary way throughout the shopping mall. And when I made this is 1980, obviously the notion of the stalker wasn't so much a part of popular culture. But now, as one of my students pointed out when I showed this recently at a film school, she would probably be arrested. So again, that question of like whether or not there can be such a thing as a female flaneuse following along from Walter Benjamin's flaneur is still up for grabs, I guess. Anyway, you can stop this. Thanks. So I made a lot of single channel videos, and after this one, and this is about 30 minutes long, and it's right on that edge of it being excruciating or not. And in order to understand the context, I also want to mention that at the time, experimental film was still around, in the sense of experimental film as the way Peter Wolin meant it when he wrote the article, Two Avant-Gardes, where many, in quotes, avant-garde artists, such as Peter Kubelka, Michael Snow, Hollis Frampton, and so on, were experimenting with the image track, but they were not making narrative. And I was playing with the notion of introducing a little bit of narrative and also reintroducing questions that had been also abolished from avant-garde film, which had to do with questions of pleasure. And I wanted to make this film that was both pleasurable and unpleasurable simultaneously. And if that's probably more than you want to know about this particular period, but it's a very important period to understand if you're looking at the history of U.S. avant-garde film from, say, the 70s up through the mid-80s. As I said, I made a number of these videotapes, and for the most part, I found the practice of making them extremely unsatisfactory, a lot of which had to do with the viewing conventions in museums. Oftentimes, when your work was shown in a museum, if you were lucky enough to be invited to show, your work was shown in a room that was in a hallway next to the bathroom, by the cafeteria, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody ever really got a chance to see your work look very good. And I became increasingly frustrated with being known as a video artist, in quotes, and also with the viewing conventions. And so I took a brief detour into MTV, and I'm going to show you. MTV starts in 1982, as most of you are way too young to know this, but it did, and I was a producer there for a while during its early days before it was bought by Time Warner, when it actually was very artist-friendly, and there were many, many artists who were affiliated in one way or another. And the interesting thing about MTV at the time was that it was trying to rethink what is television. It had no idea what it wanted to be. When it first began, it was, started by two very young boys who liked to have fun. And so there was about 4 or 5 years where it was actually fun and you could try lots of experiments. And I'm not going to go into that now, but one of the things that we did try was I made a number of very, very, very short films, of which this one is one. So if you can put in number 2. But you should turn the light out first, please, because it's very short. I think it's 10 seconds. So, and I like really short things, although I hardly ever get to do them. But
as I stepped from the shower, the chorus of Greek women blew dry my hair.
okay, stop the tape, please. Very, very short. But we were really experimenting with content and, you know, that's advertising the stuff between programming or the programming the stuff between the advertisements and so forth. Anyway, when it was bought by Time Warner, the party was over and I was fired. But not before I got to make a bunch of music videos, which were also another kind of dead end. And I'm going to show you one of those, and it's too bad that we can't turn up the sound because it really is about the music. But during the early 1980s was the beginning of the music video business, when some people got enormous budgets, other people never did. Some people got enormous budgets some of the time. And I conformed to the latter one, but I'm going to show you one of the first ones I did because it was actually for no money with Sonic Youth and Richard Kern, called Death Valley 69. So you can play that. And I made probably around 100 music videos over about 10 years. stop the tape. Anyway, that led to, as I said, I made a lot of music videos, and that also became increasingly corporatized and even more exploitative of artists' labor than the art world was. So around 1982, when I was beginning to do all these music videos and also making all these single-channel videotapes, I started to think about the coming back more into the art world as an artist. And for me, it was a moment of crisis, because I was very dissatisfied with the viewing conventions that I mentioned, and also increasingly, even in 1982, dissatisfied with the world of popular culture, since it wasn't really turning out as I had hoped. So I began to think about what might I do that would combine all of my interests. I was interested in performance. I was still interested in architecture. I had half of a PhD from UC Berkeley in film theory, feminism, and other made-up things, which I knew would be useless in terms of actually getting a job. So I thought, the art world, that doesn't look so bad. And actually, I think the art world is a place still where you can try things out and experiment. And there aren't that many other places in U.S. culture anywhere where that's possible. So I began to propose, actually, you should put in tape number 4. I began to propose this video installation, film installation called In the Shadow of the City Vampira that Julia was mentioning in her introduction. And I tried to combine all of my interests in one project. And as soon as it comes on, I will tell you about it. It was a very simple, very low-tech project. It used 2 slides on each side of a screen that bisected a room. And in those 2 slides, which dissolved continuously, I projected 2 film loops. And I made the space, here you can see the setup, and those are the film loops and the little projections, and then the slides are in the back. And I made it so that you could see the whole thing in a minute. Because obviously one of the problems of viewing video in a gallery is that no one is going to come and spend a half an hour. They really want a quick hit. And at the time, in the art world, what was around was a lot of painting. And by the way, this is not yellow. It's actually kind of pink. At any rate, so I wanted to make something that you could actually see, get in and out in maybe 15 seconds if that's all you wanted to spend, and actually have some idea of what you were seeing. And so that was sort of the brief in terms of like an architectural brief of what I was trying to do. The subject matter came from my reading of Jean-Louis Baudrillard's notion of the kind of subjectivity that you and I and everyone performs when they're in front of the television set. And in his reading, which is very, very pessimistic, we all become schizophrenics in front of the screen. And so I decided in the title, using the notion of the vampire, to propose another way of understanding our insatiable hunger for images, and that's with a vampire. And so I kind of wrote this, I thought it was funny anyway, article about this vampiric subject who has this insatiable hunger for images and who consumes images at a voracious pace and wanders the city, et cetera, et cetera. And so that became the title of the piece. And how the piece actually functioned is that because when you look at a Hollywood film, you're used to getting something called narrative closure. In other words, you look for the beginning and the middle and the end in the film. How this piece functioned was that you watched it and watched the different slides changing in relationship to the film loops, all the while looking for this narrative closure. And what would actually happen to you as a viewer as you wandered around was that you would actually never get this narrative closure, but it would excite your desire for it. And so this piece sort of kept you circling around it in this as a kind of anxious form of subjectivity. Can you stop the tape for a second? And then what I'm going to do now is, so that was my big breakthrough piece for me. I mean, it doesn't seem like that much when when I talk about it. But for me, it was a very big deal because I had solved some of these problems that I was trying to solve. The other thing that I really wanted to do at this point in the art world was I really wanted to use the art world to explore issues that I was interested in. So by this time, I had already decided something else, which as an artist is not the best solution to make, but it was the one that I made at the time, and that was not to have a signature style. So that each of my projects comes out of a research methodology, meaning I'll have an idea about something I'm interested in exploring, and then both the form and the content come from that. And obviously, in an art world which has become increasingly corporate, and we're in the kind of height of a corporate art world right now, at least in New York City, this doesn't necessarily serve you very well as an artist, but it has let me have a fairly interesting practice as an artist because it's let me follow my own interests and go where they take me rather than having to make product or the same thing so the collector can show his friend and say, oh, I have one of those, oh, I have one of those. So, but I have to say, and if somebody wants to ask me about this, we can talk about this later. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as a solution. It's just what I did. Not that it's not too late. It's never too late to change. But anyway, so the projects that I'm going to show you now very, very quickly in video form are different experiments that take up different issues. And for each one, I generally, as I said, do research. I often write an article or two, which I publish, and then I do the artwork. And the artwork may have several different parameters, like it may be film or video, it might be a book, it might be an architecture installation or an exhibition design. There's a whole part of my practice, which I'm not going to show you at all tonight, where I did a lot of exhibition designs as an artist. So if you ever see my CV, you'll see a lot of those mentioned. I have to say that in that one area, me being an exhibition designer as an artist, the art world had a very hard time accepting that. It was always like, huh? What was your role in this? Because I had crossed that imaginary divide between the artist as artist and the museum side of the artist as curator or exhibition designer. But nonetheless, I made a number of these, and I really enjoyed making these exhibition designs, like the Coca-Cola one I showed you, or the project of Display Museum of Signs, because it actually let me try out in real space stuff that I couldn't try out in my own work. And so I found this very fruitful, as well as I very much enjoyed working with the curators and designing these exhibitions. And a lot of them were themed in relationship to questions of new technology or new things that were happening in popular culture, such as zine culture. And I had brought slides of one of those to show, but I think we're going to run out of time. So I'm not going to show you those, but just remember that that's another part of my project. At any rate, can you start the tape again? After In the Shadow of the City, I made a number of pieces that were like In the Shadow of the City, sort of, but with different sets of conditions. And by 1987, when I was invited to be in the Whitney Biennial with an installation I had been in as a single-channel artist, I was up against the fact that the technology that I was using to make Super 8 film had died. And so if I wanted to do something with projection, which I did, I was forced to use video. And I began to think about what I could do using video, given the fact that I was offered two choices. I was offered the bathroom, and I was also offered the stairs. And since Kenny Scharf had the bathroom 2 years before me and had done a great job, I decided no bathroom, stairs. And then I decided, okay, what can I do? And so what I did is I decided that to use a piece that I had been collecting information for, which was called First and Third, which was immigrant stories of people who were coming to New York with their expectations. And what you're looking at here is a clip tape that I've made to try to get grants. And so every time I show First and Third, and there's 7 other pieces in this series, I use an architectural referent for the projection. But anyway, what the piece did is it actually projected on the stairwell at the Whitney Museum these different immigrant stories, which I collected using a documentary methodology. And then I edited them down to about 1 to 2 minute sound bites so that they were deliverable by an actor who was hired and paid to deliver them in one single take. And they're giant heads that are projected, and I've projected them on the side of the Tate Modern in London in 1991, on many different buildings around the world. You should turn that one down, yeah. And on glass brick, I mean, every kind of projection surface that I can find, I project on. Can you turn it down? Yeah, thanks. So after doing the first one of these, which is called First... Okay. It's just it's hard for me to talk over it. If you want to read these stories, some of them are collected in October magazine, 1995, I believe, in a piece called Not Reconciled. At any rate, so you can, so what I did is I explored like how I could use the projector, where I could project, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, I found these projects to be quite interesting, and as I mentioned earlier, I've done about 7 of them. Right now I'm working on a set of stories in Cairo using women from Carillion women, and we're going to do something with them, I hope, as soon as I can get back there, as soon as the political tensions ease a little bit. And with these stories, and each time I do them in Cairo, they're about lives, middle-class lives in Cairo. I've done them in Corsica. Can you stop the tape, please? In Corsica, I've done them about the fact that there's no 20th century culture. In Corsica, there's only 18th century agrarianism, and then tourism culture from the 20th century, but nothing in between. In Rotterdam, I did them about the kinds of housing projects that were built in Rotterdam after Rotterdam was bombed, and so forth and so on. But the thing about the stories that's the most interesting to me is that as an artist, you become a kind of facilitator, and you can disappear or get away a little bit from that kind of authorship, or your name having to be attached to everything in quite the same way as it always has to be in the art world. And I find that very liberating. And I also very much enjoy working with the different groups of people who've contacted me to do these kinds of stories. They're not exactly agitprop, and they're not speak outs. They're much more longer term stories about real social conditions that usually don't change very quickly. So they're not, for example, issue oriented. They're much more about deeper cultural issues. You can start the tape again. And this is another one, I think, from the same time period. Yeah, this is another outdoor one that I did in actually in London in 1991, where I projected outside on the in a kiosk in the Hammersmith tube stop as it was being renovated. The other thing I like about these stories, and every so often what's called City of Culture projects also provide this, is that sometimes when a cultural project works with infrastructure questions and urban issue questions, an artwork can function in a very different way. And one project that I'm not going to show you, but I'll just talk about it, was a project that I did in also around this time in Glasgow, when Glasgow was City of Culture. And the project actually used historical footage from Glasgow contrasted with all the ship plans and architecture drawings that had been done to produce the kind of glorious industrial past of Glasgow, and how the city of Glasgow, working in conjunction with a lot of artists, used this is they were able to attract a lot of media attention, which directly led to Glasgow becoming the financial capital of Western Great Britain, or the Northern Great Britain, I mean. So that the unemployment rate, which was 44% when Glasgow was City of Culture, 3 years later had dropped to 21%. So it was a very big change. The next couple of projects I'm going to show you are very short experiments. And for a while I did a lot of experiments in public space, because there was a kind of logress in the end of the 1980s, where there was a lot of money for artists and architects too to do projects in public space. And this one was done in for the opening of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and it was called, the name of my project was called Maelstrom Max Laughs, and it looked at the history of computing and computer graphics in relation to the kinds of social positions that the computer sets up. And it's about a 2-minute loop that you're meant to walk on. And for those of you, I know that I've discovered that there's not much graphics at MIT, but if anybody is a graphics person in the audience, the amount of time that we spent making this 2-minute loop was probably about 9 months of very expensive high-end time. And now you could do this in a half an hour practically on your home computer. So, the computer is really trickled down. But what the piece tried to do was have you walk on this floor, and as you walked on the floor, you decoded what was happening underneath your feet, and it's usually installed as a corridor piece. And then also it tried to take you on a ride using motion control technology. And so in the midst of this is a Mac animation from circa 1988. But the next thing that comes up is Symbolics 3D animation circa 1988, which took about 6 months to build, and it's about 30 seconds long, and it was just a major nightmare of a 3D animation to try to produce. And yet nowadays you could do it in 3D Studio Max in a heartbeat. So it's kind of a very different landscape that we're looking at now. But it was kind of interesting to try to play with those issues. I guess I think I chopped it out in this particular version. Oh no, here it comes. So just this is where it starts, and you can see it's very clunky from 1988, and then. But if you think of the computational time, I was trying to show in a kind of materialist cinema way, a la Jean-Luc Godard in his materialist cinema phase, kind of how the computer works together with motion control to create new illusions of space. So that was it, and that took 6 months. At any rate, so there's this piece, and then there's another piece that I did for a big group show, the opening of the Caesar Pelli buildings down in the financial district in Lower Manhattan, also in 1988, which is another little animation, which also took, I don't think it took quite as much time. It took maybe 3 weeks of fairly serious editing, but it was designed to question the notion of public space in the financial district in relationship to who uses public space, why there is no public space. At this particular time in New York, we had an enormous homeless population, many of whom were camped out in front of Mayor Dinkins, who was the mayor of New York at the time. They were camped out in front of City Hall, and it was a huge, huge problem. Of course, later on, when Giuliani took over, he bussed them out of the city, so the homeless people kind of disappeared, and they're not really so evident, even though we have even greater numbers of homeless people in New York City than we did back then. This is various installations of this piece. It's with all of my pieces that are site-specific, especially, I try to find homes for them in other installations because they are very expensive to make, and I think it's kind of wasteful just to do them only once. So what I tend to do is I tend to redo them or design them again into other spaces, and so you're looking at another version of this piece, which is called Adam's Wish, but the clip is going to come on in a second. Yeah, here it is. And it starts off with a worker being bored in the Caesar Pelli space, and then he yawns. And when he yawns, he basically ingests the world, and he flies into the sky, and then a number of things happen. And again, it's very much a cartoon of a certain sense of public space. And so here he is in the Sistine Chapel, and then there are all these different ways that he flies through space, and different kind of historical moments in the construction of space, until he falls into a line drawing of Donald Trump's Trump Tower in Manhattan, which you see there. and then into City Hall. And he has a number of costume changes, which, as you can see, is the homeless park. And then he looks around and he can't find another space to be. And so he actually decides that corporate space isn't so bad. And the subtext of this, in fact, was the notion that a lot of corporate space, which we often think of as public space when it's been divvied away or bargained away for air rights, is in fact actually private space. And so that was sort of the central question that this piece was trying to ask. Can you stop that tape? Now I'm going to switch to some more recent work. When you put in tape number 6, I think I'm going to talk for like 10 more minutes. Is that okay? Because I know I've been talking a long time. So, yeah. Okay. So I'll show you 3 more pieces, and I'll give you the URL for this. Well, maybe we'll show that too, just for a minute. Okay, you can start the tape. I'm not going to show the sound with this, and I'm going to excerpt these. As hopefully you can kind of tell, I really do like to experiment. And in 1993 or 1993, I was given as a gift a lot, like a kind of truck full of side illuminated fiber optics. And those are the kind of fiber optics that are fully capable of projecting sound and video. And it was sort of, somebody called me up from California and said, I'm going out of business, do you want all this stuff? And I thought of you, Julia, when I got this phone call. And I said, sure. And so on my doorstep arrived, tons and tons and tons of side illuminated fiber optics. And so then the question was, what can I do with them? And I had been invited into several big site-specific installations, which, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the 80s, there was actually quite big budgets, for me anyway, and many artists to make site-specific works. And so what you're looking at is an exploded ceiling that I made out of fiber optics for this place in Antwerp called the Muka, when Antwerp was City of Culture. And what happens is that the people on the floor are reading a glossary, which is the history of Antwerp in relationship to smart materials and magic. Antwerp has a long alchemical tradition. And while they're sitting there reading, they're also occasionally hearing their own voices circulating back through speakers that are hidden in this room. And so at the time, 1993, this piece was kind of mesmerizing in the sense that you could actually sit on the floor. For those of you who haven't been to the Muka, it's an extremely cold building. It's made out of concrete. There was no cafe at the time, et cetera. So it became, a place where people really liked to sit. You can stop that tape. Actually, can you turn the light on? Because I can't see my own notes. Can you put in tape number 8? So there's those kinds of pieces, and because I had all these fiber optics, I felt compelled to use them. And I must have made 7 or 8 of these pieces, most of which are in storage, sadly, because the tech on it was just too heavy for most collectors to deal with. Lately I've been making, and now we're kind of more into the present, I've been trying to make simpler video pieces that invokes spatiality in some way. And this is a piece called Voice Off, which is probably the most popular piece I've made simply because it only uses 2 video projectors. Many of my other pieces use 9 or 10 or 8 or 6 or something like that. And the brief for this project was to try to make something that showed how the voice might be visualized. It was a show initially for a show called Voice Off. And so I decided to stage it as 2 different sides of the same listening condition. And on one side, you had these characters. You can turn up the sound a little bit here because it'll be clearer. You have these characters who are in this kind of miasmic space, which is literally a catalog of all the ways that sound affects you when you speak. And when you're speaking, you're really possessed by the act of speaking or singing, or you find yourself singing a song that you've heard from someone else, or you find yourself hearing fragments from a movie that you've just seen, et cetera, et cetera. So that side represented all the ways the voice could possess you. On the other side, I decided in order to really stage this that I needed to have somebody listening and being affected by listening. And so on this side, I had a guy who was working in his office. And briefly what happens is he kind of is driven crazy by all the noise he hears on the other side of the screen. And so he actually breaks through the wall into the other side of this room. But by the time he gets there, of course, there's nothing there. So you as a viewer are left wondering, was he crazy? Was there really something there? What's this about? And so forth and so on. And so this piece actually has a secret screen that you can pass through as a viewer in the screen of the two sides of the projection. It's like one wall with projections on either side. You can stop the tape. Can you put in tape number 9, please? And again, I'm just kind of giving you the briefest outline of some of these, but it'll just give you a better sense for what my work is about. I also should mention that I really do a lot of book projects and graphic projects, often for shows where there's no budget for video. Oh, actually, I guess I don't want to. Oh yeah, I'll talk about this. Why not? These will be the last two that I'll talk about. I forgot about this piece. This is what you're looking at too. I should mention is video documentation. So please don't think what you saw tonight has anything to do with what the work really looks like. But in 1997, I was invited to be part of a border project called Insight, which happens every few years. And this is one of the pieces I did for them in 1997. And it's an interesting project because it's right on the border between Tijuana and San Diego. And you can see in the landscape the differences that are wrought by infrastructure questions. San Diego has all the water, Tijuana has no water. The U.S. is on one side. San Diego looks like every other Southern California town. It's very generic. Tijuana looks like Mexico. And so what I did is I made a giant sign that was T-shaped, and I projected different images. And this is one of the long horizontal sides of the image. And I tried to use the notion of water and this notion of the water, how it's used in a kind of postcard graphic way to affect what's actually projected. Can you actually fast forward in this? I'll just talk through the screens a little bit. Then I also used a water wipe play that. Sorry. I also used a water wipe in this section, which was a little, imagine a capital T and then imagine laying the T on its side. And that's in fact how this functioned as a piece of sculpture. It's about 15 feet by 15 feet on a side, and it's 10 feet tall. And usually I suspend it so it's floating in the space. Obviously I like it when it can be really, really big. This is the side where the Tijuana side and the San Diego side cross. And what I was interested in this piece was setting up these antimical relationships between the use of the land in Tijuana and the use of the land in San Diego. And this happens to be the maquiladora area of Tijuana, which is where large manufacturing plants have erected their structures. However, they don't care anything about landscaping. It's just about working and getting the work out. And so within that landscape are some very haunting pictures. And so I tried to show how they collide. And actually, when I was filming, there was a big fire there. So I happened to catch the money shot, which I was happy to do. And can you fast forward to the next one? And then the next side are the sides that represent Tijuana. And I was very particular about not taking up a point of view. In other words, I wasn't trying to say San Diego's bad and Tijuana is good, or vice versa. I really wanted people to really look at the landscape and make their own opinion, or form their own opinion. And I try to do that as much as possible in the pieces. So this shows a crosswalk, which is a certain kind of crosswalk that was invented in TJ. And I decided to use dust wipes in order to take people through the landscape. And can you fast forward to the next one? And then this is the Baja Coast, which is an incredible coast, where we all should have vacation homes or trailers, although they don't allow that anymore. But this coast, of course, is being massively developed now. And so I just used a kind of paintbrush effect to really look at what's being projected for that landscape. But it's exactly the same coast, of course, that fronts San Diego, and yet on the Baja side, it's unspoiled and not developed, et cetera, but sadly not for long. Okay, can you fast forward to the next one? Okay, and then this is a project. This is a 360-degree projection, and this is hard to talk about, and I don't have very good slides, but I just thought I would show it because it's so technologically complex, and after all, I'm at MIT, so this is my chance to talk about it. If I can't talk about it here, where can I talk about it? And what it is, it's a composite of 4 different stories that take place in that narrative, in the band, which is the narrative center of the piece. And the naked girl is projected and stretched in something that I called a leaning theater, about 360 degrees around you. It's an oval that's 7 feet by 10 feet. And that's what it looks like in a very bad video rendition where somebody's standing in the middle of the theater. And you stand in the center, and you actually can drive through the last 5 minutes in the lives of 4 characters who are dying. And the characters are in various states of human, machine, robotic, etc. So that's kind of what that piece is about. Can you stop the tape? And should we try to show this one? I guess is this hooked up? And the last one I'm going to show you is a piece that I did actually here in Boston for the ICA, right as they were fundraising for their new building that Diller and Scafidio are designing. And it's a piece called The Museum You Want. And it asks you to play a 20 questions game where I collect data from you about the kind of digital or online museum that you might find interesting. And I think I made this piece in 2002 or 2003. I can't remember, but it's been in quite a lot of festivals. And so I have a very big database about what people want. Is it not showing up? No? Oh, well. Anyway, you can visit it. If you just Google The Museum You Want, it'll come up. And I was going to show it, but I guess it's not going to. It doesn't show up at all because it's on my computer. But anyway, it's designed by the same person who actually does the 20-second question. I mean, the 20-question game. I don't know if anybody's ever played that, but his name is Robin Bergener, and he's a Canadian programmer that I've been working with for a long time. And we also have a children's game, which is the 20-second children's game, 20-question children's game, which is a little kind of device you can buy that lights up, kind of like the old, what was that old ball that you shake it and you ask it a question and it's it's based on that. Anyway, so that's the end. Everybody should stretch. Thank you.
Any questions, comments?
Joe?
It seems like there's a certain debate going on now around MIT and elsewhere about the prescriptive nature of some digital tools, so that the software that we use often will permit certain things and not permit other things. And as one who's over a number of years has been sort of at the forefront of using technology toward greater expression, I wonder if you have an opinion about that aspect of technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that debate circulates a lot. I mean, I remember it in the early 90s when Photoshop became when people were saying, oh, Photoshop is the greatest artist. and that was, do you remember that? And you'd be on a panel and someone would actually say, what do you think about the notion that Photoshop is the greatest art? I mean, I think that the answer to that is programming. And in the early 90s, there were a lot of artist programmers who, like David Rockaby and the other, I forget the other person's name, but there was actually it seemed like there was much more dialogue. I think the U.S. right now, in terms of the art market, it's just so incredibly corporate, and there's not enough debate in the art world anyway about these issues. I don't know how it is in architecture. I mean, I don't know whether people are talking about, what would happen if you were actually writing programming languages that would allow you to do the things that you need to do. Because for almost all of my work, when I take it to the next level, when you want to get, as they love to say in advertising, out of the box, you have to write programming in order to get out of the box. I mean, it's not something that happens magically. On the high end of video, I work a lot with the discrete logic products like Inferno, etc. And that, they come with plugins that you pay for, but to make them do things that you haven't seen 2,000 times, then you have to change the code, because that's how how it's written. Getting hold of that code, because it's so proprietarial, and getting access to it is very difficult. But I still think that's the answer. And a place like MIT has the opportunity to actually train people, certainly in the computing skills and hopefully in the graphic end of things, to actually be able to do this. So I mean, it should be. I think it should be happening at schools like MIT, at RIT or Rensselaer, or whatever it's called. Even at UCLA in the architecture school, it should be happening. I don't know if it is, but keep asking the question. Yeah, Ika.
Then again, in that same vein, once you do that and you put in the effort and the thought and code something new, it immediately becomes commonplace thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true of all graphic solutions, though. Yeah. I mean, that's why, for artists, I mean, I think, they're only, like, working with projectors and with video, they're only so, you could make a list of all the ways you can use the projector and what you can project on, et cetera, and it's going to be used up like that. Just like with certain tropes in advertising, nobody uses morphs anymore. If you see a morph, it's like, oh, that's really tacky. And even the camera arrays have also become a cliche, where people are, when I'm ever at client meetings and sitting in with somebody who's going to do a high-end commercial, and somebody says, oh, let's do one of those, matrix shots, and then you hear people groan. So I think, even on the high-end, things get used up. I think as artists, you have to think differently about some of these issues, and really try to make them have meaning, which doesn't happen in the corporate world, because you're never going to be able to be ahead of the curve. And I can remember in 1981, which is when that first video I showed you came out, Casual Shopper. At that time, computer graphics really weren't used very much in the art world. Computer editing had just come into being around 1978, 79, and so artists really didn't have access to the means of technology. So that little video cost me, and I was a student, so it cost me my car and, a lot of money, but it was like, $6,000 total was what I spent. By 1982, which is only like a year and a half later, I was hearing about artist video projects that had budgets of $100,000. And I just thought that was completely crazy. So, because the whole computer graphic world had entered, digital video had entered, and people were beginning to want access to these tools. And unfortunately, even if facilities were willing to give you a nighttime rate, it still costs a lot of money. So at that time, you began to see artists thinking differently about this, but also artists were realizing that this notion of being in the forefront, or the, in quote, avant-garde, is something that's very debatable in terms of those old questions about the avant-garde, in terms of the images that actually affect people's lives. And, I would say that for the most part, artists do make images that affect people's lives, but so do people working in advertising, perhaps on a broader level. But it's definitely a question that comes up all the time. Yeah.
To build on that last comment about being involved in helping, well, I'm tilting you toward the helping part about your imagination and your creativity in building environments. Have you thought of doing places, spaces in healing environments like hospitals or rehabs where there's many hundreds of hours that you have to physically go through pain, and if you can be in a fun and creative environment, then you are immersed in that, so to speak. And have you thought of that?
Well, nobody's ever invited me to do that, so I have to say no. But I'd be very interested if you have such a project, because I think that would be a good, public project to try to do. But I also would have to say at the same time that one person's idea of a comforting space is probably another person's idea of hell. So, I think it would have to be programmable to have the environment change.
Then you can have a menu or a palette of
Yeah, because when I was doing more sort of crossover, I guess I would call it, commercial artistic design, and again, this was the 80s in New York City, I did do a couple of restaurants that had environments that would change, but they never really had the money to keep them up and running, so they'd have like a 3-month shelf life, and then something would break, and then they might go out of business or something like that. But I think there's a lot of possibilities for those kinds of environments.
Just one more question, maybe?
It's an open-ended one about just your general listening to. You said you recorded some of the comments in one installation in particular you mentioned, and then you fed back so that people would hear their own voice and comments. And you have, I'm sure, overheard, but have you also recorded, or can you share some of the three-dimensional experiential comments?
Well, actually, a lot of times I don't have that luxury. I mean, I think people like to delight in the space, in the spatial experience, and even though, it's a funny thing because we're so, I guess, inundated with all these different kinds of spaces that we're overstimulated all the time. So if you can, again, this is something that the art world does that, say, going to the mall, which is equally stimulating, doesn't do very well because it's not trying to do that. But, I think that the difference is one of intent. And so when people go into an art experience, they're usually in a more contemplative mood. So they're more willing to give themselves over, whereas when you go into Bloomingdale's at Christmas time and you can't find the exit, you're really pissed off, even though that space has been very carefully orchestrated to exactly produce that effect of not being able to get out of the store. And so, I think that it's one of intent.
Judith, thank you so much.
Thank you.